I just wanted to highlight two projects that have sprung out of the amazing cookery collections of MSU. And I have a PI in the room, several PIs in the room with me, Dr. Peter Berg and Dr. Leslie McRoberts. First is a project called What America Ate. This is an NEH-funded project that the goal was to create a digital space where we think about American food during the Great Depression. It was based on a real project that happened almost 100 years ago during the Great Depression, when Americans started to collect stories about American eating. They were going to be published in a big book, and then World War II broke out. And the book was never published. All of these sources about how Americans around the country were eating were scattered. So our goal was to collect these sources, but also, it wasn't just like ethnographic sources about the poorest Americans, what they were eating. It was also about what are Americans eating in towns and cities and suburbs. And that's where the cookbook collection came in. We have over 200 community cookbooks from our collections and the University of Michigan that were digitized for this project. And then supplementing this, we decided to do another big project. We applied to the NEH and we got funding for a project called America in the Kitchen, which is part of, it's a recreation of Feeding America, which is the landmark culinary digital project really in the country that also came out of MSU more than 20 years ago. Peter Berg was the PI of that project as well. That had 76 historic cookbooks that were considered some of the most important cookbooks in American history that were digitized. This was a boon to me 20 years ago when I was a graduate student. Like all websites, the infrastructure ages, so we got funding to not only redo the website, keeping the original content, but doubling the content. And then we lost NEH funding a year ago with Doge, but MSU stepped in to provide bridge funding. So the project is still happening. In early 2027, we will be launching America in the Kitchen with about 160 historic American cookbooks going all the way up to 1960. Just a quick glimpse of some of the things that are coming out of special collections. And now I want to welcome to the podium Dr. Laura Yarez, who is an associate professor of religious studies and the author of an amazing book called Jewish Sunday Schools, Teaching Religion in 19th Century America, which came out in 2023. And now, this makes me a little nervous to say this, but she's already publishing another book that is co-authored called Judaism Mediated, Learning about Judaism Through the Cultural Arts. It's forthcoming this summer with NYU, which sounds amazing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I promise this is the last introduction before we get to the actual speaker, because there's nothing worse than a parade of introductions. But it is so nice. It is so nice to be able to bring such an accomplished speaker to MSU whose work intersects so seamlessly with some of the things that are happening in this university, with a collection that we are rightly well known for nationally and internationally, with our cookbook collection, and of course that intersects so nicely with the work that Helen and her colleagues are doing. So I do want to begin by thanking Terry Champney for establishing the Leonard Irving Gilman Endowment for Lectures and Engagement in Jewish Culture in honor of her husband, Leonard Irving Gilman. It's thanks to Terry that we're able to bring Nora here today. So we're very, very grateful to her for that. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. So, Dr. Nora Rubel is Elizabeth Donayo Professor and the Chair of Religion and Classics at the University of Rochester. She researches and teaches on a wide variety of topics related to gender, race, and ethnicity in American religion, and especially food and popular culture. She is the author of some truly amazing books, author and editor. She's the author of Doubting the Devout, which is the greatest title ever, the Ultra-Orthodox in the Jewish American Imagination, which came out in 2009 from Columbia. She's also the co-editor of Religion, Food, and Eating in North America, also from Columbia in 2014. And to talk about an overachiever, she's the co-editor of Blessings Beyond the Binary, Transparent, and the Queer Jewish Family, which came out from Rutgers in 2024. her newest book, on which this talk is based, and which is forthcoming in a few months, I think. We have an official publication of June, and there are flyers, little bookmarks in the back with a QR code. So when you finish this talk and you think, oh my goodness, I have to buy this book, we've got you covered. There's a QR code with a link to how you can get your hands on this wonderful new manuscript. Her newest book is Recipes for the Melting Pot, The Lives of the Settlement Cookbook. Please join me in welcoming Nora to Michigan.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Laura for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for hosting me. Thanks to this library that I have used without being here, because your culinary collection has been important to me and my students as well, so I've been using it for some time. It's a delight to be here in Michigan on this beautiful day. I am familiar with this weather. I live in Rochester, New York, which is very, very similar. And I haven't been here in years, but my husband's family is all from Michigan. So I have a couple of Michigan State alum in my family, and Kalamazoo College, and all kinds of Michiganders in my life. So it's nice to be back. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do that. And I guess I will start. Some of you may know this. Kool-Aid is Goyish. All Drake's cakes are Goyish. Pumpernickel is Jewish. And as you know, white bread is very Goyish. Instant potatoes, Goyish. Black cherry sodas, very Jewish. Macaroons are very Jewish cake. Fruit salad is Jewish. Lime jello is Goyish. And lime soda is very Goyish. It's from Lenny Bruce's stand-up, which, has aged in a way, but still, I feel like rings true. In 2011, Lenore Skenazy wrote a brief lament entitled, "What Remains of a Jewish Home When Even the Challah Seems Haunted?" Skenazy writes of walking into her mother's Skokie apartment and wondering, what makes a home Jewish? Now that her mother, ailing with Alzheimer's, is forgetting who she is, and her Christian caregiver lives with her and leaves her Bible tracts on the sofa, what is left that gives the home its Jewish character? Skenazy writes, well, of course there are still my mom's cookbooks. The one book she mentions by name is the Settlement Cookbook. Skenazy is not alone in her nostalgia. While the Settlement Cookbook was originally meant, in part, as a way to Americanize new and green Jewish immigrants, in later years it became it became a nostalgic way for acculturated American Jews to connect to a traditional Jewish past. Originally entitled "The Way to a Man's Heart," the Settlement Cookbook, the text emerged in Milwaukee as a 1901 fundraising pamphlet in support of a Jewish settlement house that catered primarily to Eastern European Jewish immigrants. The book was the brainchild of Elizabeth Black Kander, known as Lizzie to those who knew her, Aunt Lizzie to those who loved her, and Mrs. Simon Kander to those millions who bought her cookbook throughout the 20th century. A runaway hit from the start, the Settlement Cookbook, as it later became known, went through 40 printings, selling over 2 million copies and earning itself entrance to the James Beard Hall of Fame. Famous in the Midwest, one historian claimed, "It is no exaggeration to maintain that this book rivals beer as Milwaukee's most notable product." The eloquent Michigan-born food writer MFK Fisher was raised upon the Settlement Cookbook, calling it an oil-covered masterpiece. And culinary historian Barbara Haber, a native of Milwaukee, further noted, "I never heard of Rombauer's joy of cooking until I was grown. Go into most homes in Wisconsin and you will find the Settlement Cookbook." A traditional bridal shower gift, this cookbook became almost ubiquitous in many mid-20th century American kitchens. One Milwaukee Magazine writer declared, "There are two things no bride should be without. One, of course, is a bridegroom, and the other is a copy of the Settlement Cookbook." Skenazy is therefore not alone in her nostalgia for this cookbook. And while the book was universally acclaimed, the cookbook particularly struck a chord with Jews. Regional studies of American Jews from New York to the Midwest to the South still turn up mentions of the Settlement Cookbook as the classic reference book in the kitchen. It is rare to find any survey of Jewish cookbooks in America that doesn't mention it, and the Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink calls it probably the most important cookbook for many American Jews during the first half of the 20th century. The book finds prominent placement in the Encyclopedia Judaica, and Gil Marx's Encyclopedia of Jewish Food references the cookbook 26 times. And yet, some American Jewish historians dismiss the Settlement Cookbook as Jewish by association only. Admittedly, the cookbook's Judaic nature was questionable from the start. Despite having evolved out of a kosher cooking class, the text never drew attention to its Jewish genesis, and in fact, directly disregarded kashrut in as many creative ways as possible. The original 1901 pamphlet allowed for some mixing of meat and dairy within dishes, offered copious shellfish recipes, as well as one surreptitious recipe for potato and ham balls. And also this. The broader 1903 edition allowed for more overt mixing of meat and dairy within dishes, as in chicken a la Newburgh, or the butter that was strongly recommended for many of the steak recipes. Later editions built upon those frog legs and ham balls with more porcine offerings, such as fillet of steak with bacon, ham fried with eggs, and fried pork chops. And significantly, in no place do the words Jew, Jewish, or Hebrew appear. While Cantor's cooking classes were kosher, the cookbook was not, except for two explanatory sentences preceding the chapter on meat. Towards the bottom, you can see meat is said to be kosher when the animal from which it is taken has been cut in the throat, not knocked in the head, the blood allowed to flow out that it may not coagulate. Before using to further draw out the blood, it is soaked 1/2 hour in cold water, then allowed to stand 1 hour in salt, and then rinsed in cold water. This is the meat that later, 2 pages later, calls for 2 lumps of butter on top of their steak. So why has this non-kosher, multi-ethnic, and ostensibly non-denominational cookbook been called unabashedly Jewish and a Jewish joy of cooking by reviewers and generations of Jewish cooks? Why does Skenazy see this cookbook as marking her home as Jewish, and what gives the text this power? While the narrative ascribed to the Settlement Cookbook generally emphasizes its use as a text meant to Americanize Jewish immigrants, and certainly its origins do betray this intent, this book had many lives. This afternoon, I argue that the Jewishness of the Settlement Cookbook is coded in a way that Jews recognized while going unnoticed by non-Jews. In Henry Beale's work on Jews in film, he writes, "Only Jews or those who know the codes will interpret these elements of performance as Jewish. While general audiences may recognize these performance practices as unusual, urban, or ethnic, they will not necessarily recognize them as indicators of Jewish cultural difference. Thus, these performances implicitly indicate Jewish cultural differences while explicitly projecting a universalist, religiously and ethnically non-specific version of American society." Like Jewish performance, the Jewish foods found in Cantor's cookbook were clear to those who had cultural familiarity from them, and simply ethnically non-specific to those who didn't. One antiquarian site describes the text thus: "A discreetly Jewish cookbook. You'd miss these recipes if you weren't looking for them. Kreplech or pierogi, brisket with sauerkraut, matzah's marrow balls, etc. Published ostensibly for every housewife, but particularly for Jewish immigrant households in America." Despite its universal appeal, the early devotees of the Settlement Cookbook were overwhelmingly Jewish, and the heirloom quality of this book transcended generations, leading to the perception among Jews as a Jewish, albeit not strictly Judaic, standard. Unlike kosher cookbooks that eschew treif, it is what this cookbook includes rather than what it omits that codes the text as Jewish. It is seen and used as Jewish because of what it contained and what its competitors, such as The Joy of Cooking and Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School cookbook, did not. It contained the same recipes for New England boiled dinner and Indian pudding as Fannie Farmer, but also included 3 types of dishes that spoke to Jewish households well beyond the Jewish immigrant generation. Jewish foods, such as gefilte fish, kugel, and challah. Chinese foods, such as chop suey and chow mein, and Passover dishes, both sacramental and traditional. For the purpose of this talk, I will focus on the first 2. As Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet has noted, cookbooks, though not direct indications of what people ate, nevertheless represent Jewish cuisine and social life. The Settlement Cookbook not only reflected its Midwestern acculturated Jewish origins, but also the aspirations of a growing middle class, one that had become increasingly comfortable in America. Its genesis is steeped in Milwaukee lore. The cookbook came out of Kander's cooking classes at the Milwaukee Jewish Mission, which she helped found, and where she served as president for 18 years. Frequently referred to as the Jane Addams of Milwaukee, Kander, the upper-class daughter of Central European Jews, encouraged Eastern European Jewish immigrants to embrace New World ingredients and New World manners. As Kander repeatedly recounted, she became frustrated with the amount of time wasted by her pupils copying down the recipes and lessons, and thought she could create a pamphlet to sell to the greater community and subsequently give to her students at a much more minimal cost. She requested $18 for startup printing costs from the board of the Milwaukee Jewish Mission. The men turned her down, seeing it as an extravagance, but they did say that they would be very happy to share in her profits. Kander nevertheless went ahead with her plans and sold advertising space to local businesses to cover the printing. The first edition in 1901 was a modest pamphlet made up of 2 parts, the lessons from the cooking school and a set of favorite recipes compiled by Kander and her friends. It was distributed by the Jewish Mission and sold for 50 cents at a local department store. 9 years later, with her profits from the runaway hit, she helped buy those dubious board members a new settlement building, one that she named the Abraham Lincoln House. Like other contemporaneous domestic reformers, Kander believed that food mattered, and she too wished to quickly integrate these immigrants into American culture. However, she envisioned a multi-ethnic America and thus espoused a culinary cosmopolitanism that reflected such a reality. Kander wanted to strip ethnic food of its foreignness while simultaneously extolling the virtues of ethnic diversity. Through classes in the book they inspired, Kander created an ideal of American cultural and domestic life, which went on to influence generations of women. As the initial pamphlet made its way into the hands of Jewish women in Milwaukee and neighboring Chicago, the responses led to a review of the book's content on the part of the editors. One day, we received a letter from a lady in Chicago who had to have a matzah sponge cake for Pesach. She had just paid 50 cents for the cookbook and discovered there was no such cake in the book. And she demanded the recipe by return mail. We got busy and we delivered the goods. As can be seen by this image, the 1901 cover had nothing to suggest its Jewish association. However, the assumption that this pamphlet would contain such Pesach recipes suggests a different understanding. Kander and her companions listened to these demands for traditional Jewish recipes, such as for matzah klois, pudding, torten, and all sorts of Passover dishes. From the beginning, the cookbook offered recipes for matzah balls and filled fish, gefilte fish, But the next edition, published in 1903, included more Ashkenazic Jewish recipes. And that edition, I believe, is on display in the back. So if you get a chance to kind of putter around and look at this lovely display, I encourage it. The Settlement Cookbook reached well beyond the Midwest and its targeted demographic, making it very unusual for fundraising cookbooks. In a rare 1933 radio interview, Kander reported on the cookbook's wide distribution. "We have sold our book in England, Scotland, Australia, China and Japan, Jerusalem, Mexico, the Hawaiian, Philippine and Canary Islands, Chile and other South American countries, and Canada, Puerto Rico, and many other countries." This was 1933. Lizzie Kander died at the age of 82 in 1940, and her successor, Sarah Ettenheim, went on to turn the book into an institution. While the cookbook had been printed locally and published by the Settlement Cook Book Company since its inception, in 1953, the board entered an agreement with Simon & Schuster. The press published the subsequent editions from 1954, expanding the book to 665 pages to its final printing in 1991. At this point, the Settlement Cookbook assisted in sustaining its own legacy and propagating the legend of Mrs. Simon Kander. The prefaces after 1954 contained versions of its storied beginnings, albeit couching them in much more universal terms. It all started at the end of the 19th century when European families sought freedom and a better life in the New World. In 1965, the preface boasted, "Mrs. Kander collected treasured recipes from the committee and their friends, many of them noted Milwaukee hostesses, as well as favorite European dishes of the students and their families, even recipes from noted chefs in this country and abroad." This European coding makes for a much more universal American story. Kander, like many of her contemporaries, had sophisticated tastes and little experience with the Eastern European recipes of her pupils. She actually had to research the Jewish recipes that she put in her cookbook. These culinary investigations enabled the cookbook to better cater to its audience. But in these narratives promoted in the Settlement Cookbook, there is no mention of Jewish, Russian, or even Eastern European. The earlier instructions for koshering meat were dropped after the 1954 edition. However, in 1965, the editors refer to the ethnic background of the cookbook's original compiler when they explain Kuchen. The German word for coffee cake, Kuchen, is found often in this section of our book because many of the recipes are of German origin, contributed by the good cooks of Milwaukee. Much of Milwaukee's population, both Jewish and Gentile, was of German ancestry, so this doesn't really give much away. In his classic mid-century study of American religion, Protestant Catholic Jew, Will Herberg remarks on American gastronomic identity. "Our American cuisine includes antipasto and spaghetti, frankfurters and pumpernickel, filet mignon and French fried potatoes, borscht, sour cream, and gefilte fish on a perfect equality with fried chicken, ham and eggs, and pork and beans. And recipes for all of these dishes can be found in the Settlement Cookbook." But according to Ellen Steinberg and Jack Prost, authors of From the Jewish Heartland, 2 Centuries of Midwest Foodways, for many Jews today, it is the Jewish cookbook. In fact, when we were soliciting heirloom recipes from women in Michigan and Wisconsin, they told us they still use the Settlement Cookbook. In the Cohn family, writes Miriam Graber Cohn of Vicksburg, Mississippi, the only cookbook I saw was the Settlement Cookbook. Similarly, journalist Fred Wasser reports, "When I was growing up, the Settlement Cookbook was the only cookbook I can recall ever seeing in our kitchen in Flushing, New York." In reverse diaspora fashion, the cookbook made its way to Israel. In Jacob Ariel's family, the cookbook traveled from Detroit to Jerusalem. His mother, a Michigan native, immigrated to Palestine in her youth, bringing with her the Settlement Cookbook. And for Ariel, that cherished volume was an American cookbook. "Growing up," he said, "I always pictured this as a text that the pioneers used." The book received celebrity endorsement as well. The legendary New York baker, William Greenberg Jr., reportedly began with recipes from the Settlement Cookbook. Famed Jewish cookbook author Joan Nathan has noted that the text reigned supreme in early 20th century American Jewish households, and she herself owns 18 different editions of the book. I think I'm gaining on her. Her mother received one as a wedding gift in 1937, and it was always her go-to cookbook. Nathan says, she always looks at it for recipes, even though I've written 9 cookbooks. She considers it her Bible. This quote is from over 10 years ago, and Nathan has since published 3 more cookbooks, but you understand. Likewise, the late kosher restaurateur Leah Spielberg Adler, filmmaker Steven Spielberg's mother, reminisced, I always loved to cook, especially when my kids were young. The Settlement Cookbook was my Bible. Referring to one's favorite cookbook as a Bible is not unusual. In the first half of the 20th century, 2 cookbooks competed for the status of kitchen standard. The Boston Cooking School Cookbook, first published in 1896 and later renamed the Fanny Farmer Cookbook after its author, and the Settlement Cookbook. I've thrown in the Joy of Cooking because that's a more recent cooking Bible. Which book American cooks selected spoke volumes about their ethnic preferences. Barbara Haber notes, while Fanny Farmer's British-style recipes were not appealing to this population of Eastern European descent, the ethnic recipes found in the Settlement Cookbook were. And these cookbooks are not just relics gathering dust. Like sacred texts in any religious tradition, they are read, they are passed down, and they provide comfort, direction, sustenance, both physical and spiritual. Anne Ramirez writes of Methodist community cookbooks that, quote, on occasions of ceremony and necessity, cookbooks were consulted like oracles. After the Immigration Act of 1924, Jewish immigration practically comes to a standstill. The American Jewish community, therefore, became less in need of Americanization and further set its sights on upward mobility. Additionally, Jews lost connection with the old country as changes occurred in the family unit and geography. No longer was there necessarily a bubby at a kitchen to teach you how to make matzo balls or kugel. Cooking became less a mimetic experience and one far more derived from text. Again, Joan Nathan cites her mother. The way that my mother makes matzo balls is in there. Everything she wants to do that's Jewish is straight from the Settlement Cookbook. There is really no such thing as Jewish food, repeatedly insists Jewish cookbook writer Claudia Rodin. Few traditional Jewish foods are uniquely Jewish. A diasporic people from their beginnings, Jews have adopted the foods of their host country, adapting them to fit their dietary laws. However, the classic 1941 guide, Jewish Home Beautiful, asserts if there is any one particular food that might lay claim to being the Jewish national dish, gefilte fish is that food. And if there was to be one recipe announcing the cookbook's Jewish bona fides, it was its recipe for filled fish, nestled alongside other recipes for shellfish. An insider's dish, to be sure. Gefilte fish is the classic example of cucina povera, as its minced nature allowed for potential stretching with breadcrumbs or matzah meal if necessary. As tends to happen with such recipes, it has been elevated to an almost sacred, elegant addition to the Jewish menu. As separating bones is prohibited on the Sabbath, this boneless chopped fish dish allows for the enjoyment of fish at the Sabbath table. Indeed, gefilte fish was a typical appetizer on Friday evenings and holidays, typically served with a beet-flavored horseradish on the side. The Settlement Cookbook also provided a recipe for beet and horseradish relish. Fish is also supposed to be an aphrodisiac. So if you can imagine gefilte fish as a Friday night aphrodisiac, go ahead. One of the few classic Jewish dishes to appear in 1901, gefilte fish was traditionally served as described, literally a filled fish. However, in the 20th century, it became popular and far easier to serve the fish in balls. The Settlement Cookbook first printed such a recipe in 1943. entitled Lincoln House Fish Balls, after the name of Milwaukee's settlement house at the time. It is not until 1965 that the filled fish recipe is referred to as stuffed whole fish, gefilte fish. The Lincoln House fishball variation of gefilte fish is featured prominently in the settlement menu under buffet entertaining, particularly the smorgasbord, which they write is a popular version of buffet entertaining. A settlement-suggested version of smorgasbord might include these dishes, as listed, and the editors write, smorgasbord is a popular variation of buffet entertaining. It can vary in size and elaborateness depending on the number of guests to be served, but the basic ingredients are always fish, meat, cheese, salads, and relishes. So most of the elements in this particular, on this list, are not surprising. Salmon, pickled fish, potatoes, cucumbers, Swedish meatballs. All of these seem very much at home in a Scandinavian spread. Apart from the meatballs, those elements are equally at home on a Eastern European Jewish table. There's plenty of overlap between Ashkenazi and Scandinavian cuisine. The inclusion of the Lincoln House fish balls in the smorgasbord makes sense gastronomically. It's poached fish of some kind, but not exactly culturally. The inclusion, the editors have also included baked beans, a quintessential American addition. This menu embraces the settlement's original agenda of culinary pluralism. Why shouldn't everyone like both Swedish meatballs and gefilte fish?
The two dishes enrich the elaborate spread, and just like the Scandinavian tradition of the smorgasbord became a means of American entertaining, traditional Jewish foods could also play a part. Far from being limited to the Midwest and Northeast, the book's appeal extended across the country. In celebration of the 1954 publication of the New Settlement Cookbook, a Thomasville, Georgia newspaper suggested that the letters from the millions of readers of the Settlement Cookbook constitute what is perhaps the best available straw vote on Americans' recipe favorites. The book's editors, the newspaper's editors, announced the top 10 readers' favorite recipes, and the Lincoln House fish balls came out on top. Of the 10, the paper chose to reprint with permission the following 3: sauerbraten, pot roast, fluffy chocolate frosting, and Bing cherry ring. While the fish balls topped the list, they were apparently not deemed popular enough in Thomasville, Georgia to print, and that could possibly be because of the specifically Jewish nature of that dish.
Claudia Rodin, again, once wrote, "A test of who is a Jew is supposed to be whether you like cholent." The same might be said about gefilte fish. Thus, it appears that the Settlement Cookbook's Jewish readers placed the fish balls at the top of the list. A dish with both religious and ethnic significance, Donald Weber suggests that nostalgia for food can serve as, quote, an agent of social incorporation. How, that is, the offering of, say, gefilte fish enacts a ritual of integration, of conformity, and above all, of reassurance. Again, as an insider food, gefilte fish acts as a signifier of sorts, suggesting both difference and solidarity. Kitchen Judaism has been used to disparage radically different Jewish adherents over the years. In the 19th century, the phrase was first hurled by reform activists at those traditionalist Jews clinging to dietary restrictions in the face of modernity. Later, the term came to refer to the performance of nostalgic Jewish foodways, a more secular gastronomic investment in lieu of synagogue attendance. And in 1949, in a commentary essay, critic Leslie Fieldler wrote of the latter. It is well known that the last nostalgia of the assimilating Jew is for hot pastrami and gefilte fish. Kugel Jews, the scornful phrase called them. And yet, there is, in the last trivial loyalty, a scarcely conscious memory of the sacramental nature of the Jewish meal. Such loyalty and hunger were filled by dishes available in the Settlement Cookbook.
Of Fiedler's Kugel, Rice, a variety were available. Kugel, rice kugel, noodle kugel, matzah's charlotte, matzah's pudding, all in a section called, perhaps, euphemistically, grandmother's puddings.
In 1915, recipes appeared for blintzes, and in parentheses, cottage cheese pancakes in the pancakes and syrups chapter, as well as a traditional recipe for challah, Sabbath twists. In 1976, 2 recipes for challah are offered. Other typical Jewish foods include kasha and kishke, buckwheat grits and stuffed casings, and also, of course, macaroons. As Lenny Bruce insisted, macaroons are very Jewish cake. And while the cookbook certainly did not directly call attention to its Jewish nature, neither did it deny it. In the section on chafing dishes, Candor offered an uncharacteristic bit of history. It is said that the chafing dish originated with the Israelitish women, and that it has been used throughout each succeeding generation by both men and women.
This chafing dish tradition presumably refers to the slow-cooked stews, such as cholent, that Jews would begin to heat before the Sabbath so as to have a hot meal on Saturday afternoon.
Although the following recipes in the section were likely not utilized by those Israelitish women: lobster a la bordelaise, lobster a la Thackeray, and creamed crab meat, Candor claims her place in their lineage and suggests a model for Jews as part of an American history, if not of world history.
The cookbook, while revised frequently over its many editions, was radically revised in 1965. We know that many of you were perfectly happy with us as we were. We hope you will be even happier with this new book. We have made every effort to retain the things you like about the earlier editions, especially the treasured heirloom recipes. More and more Jewish heirlooms took their place alongside the original filled fish. The overwhelming majority of mid-century American Jews actually did not keep kosher, but many liked to keep Jewish and at least enjoy traditional Jewish recipes on holidays.
Nathan Abrams suggests that gefilte fish was upheld as a method of prevention against assimilation, as represented by the consumption of Chinese food. This could be seen in the Der Tag Yiddish newspaper's suggestion, "Down with chop suey, long live gefilte fish." While there were certainly kosher cookbooks available in the first half of the 20th century happy to protest American assimilation, none provided the breadth of the SettlementCook Book, allowing Jews to have their gefilte fish and eat chop suey too. The Jewish American affinity for Chinese food has by now become a well-worn punchline, a 20th century truism bolstered by Borscht Belt comedians and sociologists alike. Food historian Hannah Miller writes, even secular Jews who fumble with tefillin and mezuzot, the traditional cornerstones of Jewish material culture, may feel a nostalgic stir at the sight of the wire-handled red and white Chinese takeout box. But where and whence did this love emerge? Historian Andrew Haley writes that middle-class Americans at the turn of the century amused themselves by going slumming. They set out in carriages to ethnic enclaves where they explored strange alleyways full of street vendors, visited unfamiliar houses of worship and opium dens, and almost invariably experienced new foods.
Partially due to this experimentation, the early 20th century saw the emergence of Chinese food as a favorite among the middle class, particularly for Jews and the children of Jewish immigrants. As early as 1899, the American Hebrew mentioned and criticized Jewish immigrants' fondness for Chinese food.
Of course, Jews liked Chinese food for the same reasons other Americans did. It was relatively inexpensive, it tasted good, and it came with a whiff of the exotic. But Chinese food becomes known as a second cuisine for Jews. Eating Chinese becomes something known that modern American Jews did, an aspect of group identity. According to sociologists Gay Tuchman and Harry Levine, eating in Chinese restaurants signifies that one is not a provincial or parochial Eastern European. Jew, not a greenhorn or a hick. It is this cosmopolitanism that eating Chinese signified that was perhaps the most important element.
For pre-1948 American Jews, people without a homeland, being a citizen of the world was a necessary point of pride. Eating in a Chinese restaurant also held another appeal for Jews, the possibility of being white. In contrast to the Chinese immigrant restaurateurs, Jews felt less foreign, more American. Philip Roth's protagonist with Fourtnoy's complaint uses, to them, we are not Jews, but white, and maybe even Anglo-Saxon. No wonder they can't intimidate us. To them, we're just some big-nosed variety of wasp. Andrew Haley notes that the early 20th century American interest in eating Chinese food did not result in less discrimination in immigration laws. Perhaps sensory judgment rather than a political choice led people to crave a new culinary sensation without their giving much thought to those who prepared it. By the 1920s, Chinese food became much more mainstream. Mahjong, a game particularly popular among Jewish women, became a nationwide craze, and along with it, a taste for chop suey. The dish, Miller writes, is, politely put, Chinese-esque. While employing the fine mincing of meat and vegetables common in Chinese cooking, the dish has no true equivalent or ancestry in China. Its actual place and time of origin is unknown, but historians are in general agreement that the dish is a product of late 19th or early 20th century America. Nevertheless, Americans went mad for it, and by World War II, chop suey and its more authentic counterpart, chow mein, was a staple in Army mess halls, appearing as the only foreign recipe in the 1942 edition of the U.S. Army Cookbook. But the Settlement Cookbook was again ahead of its time, offering a chop suey recipe in 1910. The 1915 edition included chow mein and Chinese rice. As the years went on, more variations of chop suey were added. In the menu section of the 11th edition, which came out in 1921, Candor offered, alongside oyster supper, Sunday night buffet supper, and various luncheon menus, the following.
This remained the only identifiably ethnic menu provided in the Settlement Cookbook for decades. And I just wanted to say, apropos of nothing, I got in late last night, so I ordered takeout from Charlie Kang's, and chop suey is on the menu. Let's see, where was I? As the editions moved on, American tastes expanded and more exotic dishes appeared. By 1965, the Settlement Cookbook offered 3 versions of chop suey, all containing ingredients a bit more in line with Cantonese cooking. In addition to her tireless work on the Settlement Cookbook, Candor also wrote a Sunday cooking column for the Milwaukee Telegram. She published the following in 1924. Requests for recipes and ideas on what to serve at mahjong parties have come for our readers.
Since mahjong is now quite the rage all over the country, we are pleased to offer suggestions for appropriate menus and recipes of Chinese dishes that can be prepared at home. Candor's suggestions include tea or rice, some sort of chop suey, chow mein,
preserved ginger, kumquats or figs, and often chicken noodle soup. Mahjong, along with Chinese food, was particularly popular among Jewish women. While the game fell out of fashion by the end of the 1920s, Jewish women held on and created the National Mahjong League in 1937. The Yiddish press expressed some concern that this craze over all things Chinese was replacing Jewish traditional foods in American Jewry. They needn't have worried. The Settlement Cookbook had them covered there too. In the same 1921 edition that offered a Chinese supper menu also included a Passover cookery section in the index, followed in 1924 with a menu for a Passover Seder supper. So I'm including this just because I think it's cool and funny. There's a menu for a Passover Seder supper, and It calls for an appetizer, an individual charosis appetizer, in case you can't read that small. Individual charosis appetizer in a half lemon shell surrounded by a quartered hard-cooked egg, thin slice of horseradish root, sprig of parsley, and radishes on a bed of watercress. Serve with salt water. So for those of you that are familiar with a Passover Seder, those are all the things one is supposed to eat in a certain order, which is what Seder means. And it is, presented in this like very bougie individual plate, which actually, every time I read this, I want to do that for Passover. Like I always just think like, just once I'm gonna do a half lemon shell, and like by the time it comes, I don't. But and you can kind of think like, is this the recipe without the ritual, or is this a way of making the ritual modern and holding on to it? So this is kind of one of the things that when you study cookbooks, you kind of don't know unless you're talking to people who are actually following that recipe. Until this 13th edition, no holiday menus were offered in the Settlement Cookbook. When added, it included such festivities as Thanksgiving dinner and Washington's birthday luncheon. While the Passover menu is the only Jewish holiday represented,
Comparable and contemporaneous editions of The Joy of Cooking and Fanny Farmer contained no such recipes. Instead, they contained menus for Christmas dinner, sections on Christmas cookies, and recipes for Easter biscuits. But the Settlement Cookbook also included menus for Christmas and Easter dinner, as well as the odd Christmas cookie, but distinguished itself
by its inclusion of non-Christian holidays and celebrations of ethnicity. In fact, in all of the editions, the only religious holidays mentioned by name are Passover, Christmas, and Easter. There is a random hamantaschen recipe, but it's not in a Purim menu or anything like that. So, is the Settlement Cookbook Jewish?
Claudia Rudin, again, despite insisting that there are no specific Jewish foods, also describes Jewish foods as being those dishes that provide, quote, a link with the past, a celebration of roots, a symbol of continuity.
What set the cookbook apart in the first half of the 20th century was its breadth. It contained many of the same recipes as these other cookbooks, but also provided recipes for noodle kugel. But by the 1950s, such breadth began to be seen as problematic by some. It was not enough to be a kugel Jew, and mid-century Jewish cookbooks began to emphasize Jewish difference. But here, it is what such cookbooks omit that make them Jewish, demonstrating a definition of Jewish food as kosher, regardless of popular practice. These culinary shifts are in line with what Chaim Soloveitchik notes on the shift from mimetic practice to a heavy reliance on text. Jewish women traditionally learned to cook from watching their mothers and grandmothers. As the 20th century moved along, those who adhered to Jewish observance began to emphasize a stringency that hadn't been prevalent in the earlier generations of American Jews. No longer could the older generation be trusted with merely passing on Jewish practice. It had moved too far away from Jewish law and needed more supervision. The result is a much stricter adherence for those who consider themselves traditional. Soloveitchik laments,
the simple fact is that the traditional Jewish kitchen has been immeasurably and unrecognizably amplified beyond all halachic requirements. The legal exegesis that characterized late 20th century Judaism infiltrated the kitchen, requiring more than just separate dishes and kosher meat, sometimes required separate refrigerators and Chol of Yisrael.
The Balabusta's intuition needed more oversight, as did the texts that included her favorite recipes. This new rigor was not restricted to the kitchen. It infused all elements of Orthodox life, but it is specifically in the kitchen that women's autonomy becomes reduced. Cookbooks like the Settlement Cookbook were thus less likely to be the go-to text for Jews who were looking for guides on how to be Jewish. Lawrence Roth, in his study of kosher cookbooks in the 90s, suggests of kashrut that it serves as a kind of floating signifier, an indeterminable word whose connotations and associations mobilize Jewish difference, solidarity, and legitimacy. So, given all we know about its origins and its many lives, what kind of signifier is the Settlement Cookbook? And I am wrapping up. Vanessa Oakes writes of explicitly and implicitly Jewish objects. Explicitly Jewish objects can manifest in three forms. Signs that clearly say a Jew inhabits this place. A Jew inhabits this place. Props that say this object is needed in Jewish life. And catalysts that say the presence of this object creates and maintains Judaism. Implicitly Jewish objects are by definition more covert. They do not announce themselves as Jewish in the ways that explicitly Jewish objects do, nor do they have an obvious Jewish purpose. Nevertheless, according to Oakes, they can subtly embody, create, and express kedusha, or holiness, by their presence. I contend that while the Jewishness of the Settlement Cookbook may appear implicit, the text served as a sign, prop, and catalyst for Jewish life and living in the 20th century, despite its non-kosher elements. And while there are no new editions of the Settlement Cookbook in the 21st century, the book continues to generate a sort of afterlife beyond the nostalgia expressed within memoirs, food columns, and other personal essays.
As you can see, multiple editions inhabit shelves of institutions worldwide. A mass of associated materials is dispersed in archives, and in 3 months, it will also have a biography.
The nostalgia associated with this cookbook should not be discounted. As Rachel Gross writes, describing American Jewish nostalgia as an American Jewish religious practice matters, because the term religion helps us to understand the practices and ideas that are meaningful to American Jews. Robert Orsi, in his 1985 book, The Madonna of 115th Street, popularized the study of lived religion as a means of studying the way ordinary people understand their own religious lives. For Orsi, religion is what really matters to people. Oakes expands on this when discussing the study of material culture, stressing how things matter, to whom, and in what ways. In the years I've spent on this project, I have collected multiple editions of the Settlement Cookbook. Some have been purchased in used bookstores or on eBay and Etsy, but my favorite way to acquire copies of this cookbook is through estate sales. Many estate sales services will post pictures online of some of the items that will be listed for sale, and I will look for the telltale signs that a Jew inhabits this place. I will look for Oakes's signs, props, and catalysts. Candlesticks, menorahs, a certain style of art. And once I have determined that a Jew likely lived in that home, I will go cookbook hunting. I am frequently successful. These editions are well worn, sometimes held together by tape or rubber bands, often annotated in the margins, and occasionally containing recipe cards from the owner. Oakes writes of such inherited objects as possessing a particular resonance, regardless of whether they are ascribed value only by the family or hold value independently. The presence of the Settlement Cookbook, such as in Lenore Skenazy's mother's apartment or in the estate sales that I haunt, provides us with a sign that a Jew once lived here. The Settlement Cookbook is not just an artifact of generations past. Catholic writer Barbara Mani, newly married to an observant Jew, wrote in a review of the 1991 edition that the volume enabled her to make matzo balls. Who ever thought that one could slip a Jewish mother-in-law behind a plexiglass holder and from there by the side of the stove be led silently, step by printed step, through a recipe regarded right up there with the formula for the atomic bomb? She has since written much about her interfaith marriage, describing her first attempts at setting a Shabbat table with 2 Israeli candlesticks, a Kiddush cup for wine, and a braided loaf of challah. Over 3 decades later, she still makes her own challah weekly and begins to cook for Shabbat by, quote, cracking into the cookbooks of my various adopted Jewish mothers, perusing the spiral-bound recipes of temple sisterhoods from around the country. Mahani began making Judaism with the aid of this cookbook, this catalyst for Jewish living. And while there may be other kosher culinary guides for the perplexed, this one still seems to hold its place. Very Jewish. Thank you.
I got the Settlement Cookbook from my mother-in-law when we were married in 1970. And
Did you bring it?
yes,
What-
got it here. It's got a shiny cover.
What edition is it? Do you know?
I don't know because one of the pages got lost, removed
Very typical. Okay, yes.
removed so many times that some pages got loose. But I remember my in-laws hardly ever took vacations. They worked very hard lives their whole lives. And then when they retired, they decided with some other in-laws to go to Israel, and they loved that trip. So then they felt like they'd been world travelers, so their next trip they were going to take was to China. And when they got back, I asked my father-in-law how he liked it, and he said, it was okay, but they didn't have any Chinese food there. He was so used to chunking and everything. So it was really funny. And when I read this book, I was always confused because there was a pork recipe in it, and there was a junket recipe which called for, a feet. I mean, I think junket was made out of hooves with milk. So it was like meat and milk combined. And so I was really confused by the cookbook a lot. But I thought a lot of the descriptions were wonderful, how to make things. And I was especially intrigued by the hot box, the fire box,
Fireless cooker.
for keeping
I mentioned it in the class. Yeah.
the dish made before the holiday or before Saturday warm. I thought it was a good idea, except for crunching up so many newspapers to keep it warm in the box. I thought that
Yeah,
would take a lot of time.
It was later, I think, taken over by the crock pot, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well,
Which was actually created by the Jewish son of Lithuanian immigrants. And it was actually made for the purpose of making cholent. Because he had heard the stories of the communal ovens in Europe that women would take their pots to on Friday and then get on Saturday. And he thought, I can do better than that. And it was originally called something like Naxon's Beanery. And then it was bought by Rival or something. Anyway, it became what we know of as the crock pot.
well, now we have a Jewish oven from Japan, which allows us to make things stay ahead and hold it. So,
Very nice.
anyway.
Thank you.
There's codedness going on, but there are also these moments of explicit Jewishness from the beginning. What did both Jewish and non-Jewish readers make of what might have seemed some confusing messages?
Well, I mean, from people that I've talked to, and when I give talks, people bring their cookbooks, which I love. And I non-Jewish readers have often said, like, I had no idea this had any kind of Jewish genesis in it. And Jewish readers were like, I was always confused why there was pork in it, but it definitely is a Jewish cookbook, right? And I think part of this has to do with the way people use cookbooks. I mean, if you look at one of yours, right, it probably opens to a certain section, right? There's stains in certain areas, and there's probably places you never go, right? So if you use it purely for baked goods, or this is where you go for your Passover matzah brie recipe, then you're not looking for pork or whatever, and also a lot of Jews did not keep kosher too. So I think it's in retrospect that for Jews to look at it and say, well, this is a little odd, right? If this is a Jewish cookbook, why is it like this? But most early 20th century Jewish cookbooks contained non-kosher recipes. So that was very common at the time, particularly community cookbooks. And I did, when I was in, I had a position as a visiting professor in New London, Connecticut, for my first job. And the Sisterhood of a Conservative Synagogue there put out it's very unusual for a community cookbook to get picked up by a press. They put out a cookbook called From Manna to Moose that was then picked up as a Dover paperback, like pocketbook, which my mother had. My mother is Israeli. I had never heard of the Settlement Cookbook until I was in graduate school, so this is not a thing I grew up with. But she did have this cookbook, which was like her way of trying to learn how to cook Jewish American, I think, like for my dad. But I got to interview, and this book came out in 1969. And I got to interview a bunch of people who had been on the editorial board. And that was like great. But, you know, and they all kind of told the same stories. Like the worst part of it was making sure you weren't offending anyone, right? Like, because some of their friends aren't great cooks, so it's like they had to give them something, but like, and how many tuna casserole recipes can you contain in one thing? And in most community cookbooks, you know, your name is in there, right, with your recipe. Not so for the Settlement Cookbook. From the beginning, it was like, these are tested recipes. They came from the test kitchen. But the second hardest thing was that they had to change a lot of recipes so that they would be kosher. So it was like changing butter to margarine in a lot of the meat dishes. And so I always asked, did you ever think about just leaving it in? Like, this is a recipe that this person, you know, contributed. Why are you changing it? And she said, and they would say, like, oh, I mean, it's a Jewish cookbook. We would never have a non-kosher recipe in a Jewish cookbook. And my follow-up question was always, so at your synagogue, you know, like, what do you think the percentage of Jews that kept kosher was? And she'd be even more shocked. Nobody kept kosher. You know, so it's just this kind of like, what is this representation that's being put out, right, versus the reality of what people actually do, which I think is like, when we talk about religion, that's also a question, right? Like, there's what we're supposed to do, and there's what we do, which is kind of our lived practice. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I was noticing in the publication history this kind of consolidation in the 50s and 60s. What is the relationship between the evolution of the Settlement Cookbook and, say, the American Jewish Cookbook by London and Con Bischoff, which comes out in the 50s, if you know that one? Yes. Which is designedly using American Jewish kind of melting pot kind of vocabulary, but has a much more explicit and comfortable, I would say, relationship with its denomination of its recipes as Jewish or not, or American Jewish. And is there a reaction in the evolution of Schuster's publication here that's related to that cookbook or other cookbooks like that?
So that's a great question. And I believe in that cookbook, recipes are marked, right? Whether or not they're dairy, milk, parve, which is very typical of cookbooks that start to emerge in the 50s and 60s. And if they're being, you know, marked as Jewish, right? And it's really not until like the early aughts here that you start to see Jewish cookbooks that are not kosher again. But they are like overtly Jewish, right? They're like, you know, the Mild and Deli cookbook that has like a bacon egg cream, you know, like where they're playing with Jewish food and not saying that it needs to be kosher to be Jewish, right? Which is the opposite of what happens in the mid-20th century, right? There's sort of this idea that you need to make Jews out of Americans, right, as opposed to Americans out of Jews. I just was in Professor Yaris's class, and we were talking about this. The heart, so The Way to a Man's Heart, which was its initial title, right, like that became very...
A reason to cook.
Yeah. You know, I mean, this is not, you know, this is part of the book, but not what I talked about today, which is that, It comes out of a cooking school. There's a lot of concern in the early 20th century about spousal abuse and drunkenness, and a lot of it was blamed on bad cooking. And so these cooking schools were supposed to cure men from going to saloons, and I mean, it's a very dark story. That's not what the story I told tonight. But yeah, so the way to a man's heart is important at this time, and the idea that you'd keep him at home by making good food. And so that's a common concern. But also it's just sort of, it's cute, right? And at the time of these like early community cookbooks, there were always like these cutesy little things of like how to cook a marriage, or like how to keep a husband, and like poetry and stuff. The Settlement Cookbook never had anything like that. Like it was that part about the chafing dishes until the like 1965. It is like purely encyclopedic, right? There's no head notes. There's nothing like the chafing dish thing was really unusual. The hearts that are on the later ones are a compromise for taking The Way to a Man's Heart off the cover. Because Simon & Schuster is like, I mean, we're kind of getting to a point where that seems, I don't know, sexist? And there are all these, like, so the Sarah Ettenheim, who took over as the chief editor, I have all of this amazing correspondence between her and the editors at Simon Schuster. She just felt like it was their trademark. We had to, and they also sued people that would use The Way to a Man's Heart as a phrase in a cooking column anywhere. They would go after them with lawyers. They're like, this is our thing, even though like, is it? Like, so, and then at one point, one of the editors says, well, the heart suggests now we're trying to talk about healthy food and heart healthy food, and the recipes in the Settlement Cookbook are not. So maybe so they would kind of like compromise on having like a heart somewhere. Sometimes it was on the inside page. So if you look over there, you can kind of look for the heart. So that's kind of where that comes from. And the 1991 edition has nothing. Like there's no heart, and it doesn't say The Way to a Man's Heart anywhere. They were just like, it was a non-starter. And they're starting to lose the need for this type of cookbook, right? So you start to see, particularly after Julia Child and the Mastering the Art of French Cooking, you start to see a lot more niche cookbooks. I do think that the 1965 edition is in conversation with that one because suddenly it's more chatty and folksy, and there's like a touch of foreign recipes. That's where the smorgasbord thing is. And although they mention it earlier, but this is where kind of they talk about it more. And so there's less of a need for a general cookbook. So you still have that. You have The Joy of Cooking. But when they were publishing it themselves, they were putting it out essentially every year. And then the editors at Simon & Schuster were like, okay, we're going to need 30% more new content to make a new book. And there's a period of time where they're trying to figure out whether or not they should, do some of the changes that the editors wanted them to do, that the press wanted them to do, which is like, can you bring in some more healthy things or talk about soul food or, yogurt? They were certainly not immune to the period of time where cookbooks started to suggest for quick things like whatever, like the tuna casserole, with the green bean casserole, where you have the
mushroom soup.
So there are a couple of recipes that use canned soup. Like they do, it does follow the trends, right? So you can see changes in cooking technology, changes in the types of products. I use this. I have to say that I have not used this cookbook very much. I feel like I need to, like, before the book comes out, like, make more of these recipes, because the problem is that I started working on this book and then I became vegan. And so I did just recently make their Swedish meatballs with Beyond Meat, and they were delicious. But the first recipe I did make from them was for my daughter's birthday cake when she turned 3. My mother-in-law, who is from Michigan, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law are avid bakers. And I was like, I am going to make a recipe. I'm going to make a cake, and I'm going to make it from this cookbook. And so she was like hovering around me like the whole time. She's like, you're not using cake flour. And I'm like, the cookbook is from 1923. And they didn't have that yet, you know, like, so you can see like the introduction of new types of ingredients, right? You know, like they still were able to make cakes in 1923 without cake flour, right? Like there is, you know, maybe it was easier later, but yeah. So I mean, there's just, it's one of the great things about looking at this book is that it's 100 years. There's so many changes that occur, both like domestically and kind of within the broader world. So, thank you. That's a good question.
Based on those, there are 2 pictures of 2 books. In 1903, like only 2 years after the original, right? Mm-hmm. And there's no art, no mention of.
I think that, so to be honest, I think that is a facsimile. There are a bunch of copies floating out there that are facsimiles of the 1903 edition. So this one, it looks like it says it anyway.
It says
it says 1903, right?
But
So,
it says the way. It's just covered up by the blue book.
Is it, you think?
Maybe, but this is what the 1903 one looks like, and you can see it back there. Then you get like lots of little maids, and then there's just but this is the 1901 pamphlet. This one just doesn't have its cover, like its dust cover on it, and this one was a condensed, like a digest version of it that they put out in 1958 that was cheaper and smaller because they were just trying some new things. In the 80s, they were thinking about doing a baking book, and it became like this long, drawn out, like sad, like it almost felt like a broken romance, like it has been months since I have heard from you. Which ultimately didn't end up happening, but yeah. Yes?
So you made a couple of allusions in the talk to this being a very Midwestern cookbook, and since moving to the Midwest, I found it's a rather interesting place to eat food. And I'm wondering if you could comment on some of the sort of Midwestern qualities of it in contrast to other kinds of especially Jewish cookbooks that are being produced in other areas of the country. Like, how do you see it coded as a Midwestern book?
So primarily it's Midwestern in that it is so, the early editions are so German in their influence, right? And, the Jewish community in the Midwest is really an interesting one, particularly Milwaukee, in that, Jews weren't new there, right? Like they came in with everybody else when the city was being built, whereas it's different if you're like, okay, New York, then it's, the series of different immigration patterns, right? They thought of themselves as Germans in Milwaukee, right? So even though, like, yes, definitely there's this sort of like, oh, Europeans, but they thought of them, it's not really until World War I or World War II where they're like, yeah, you know what, we don't have to be German anymore, but I would say that that's probably primarily, and then it develops this Ashkenazi kind of version. You see in later editions, in 1965, maybe it's either 65 or 73, where you start to see shashlik and shish kebab. which kind of mirrors other Jewish cookbooks at the time, which suggests like travel to Israel. Even though shashlik is really like Russian, but it became very popular as sort of this grilled item, you know. And you see these kinds of changes over time. Does that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Slightly embarrassing. It seems like everyone may already know the answer to this question, but why do you think the publication was discontinued?
So, the 1991 edition was sort of like a last. Sarah Ettenheim, who was really like the force behind it as an institution, retired in the late 80s. But she had been keeping it going for such a long time. And as I alluded to, there's this period where like, you know, she's dealing with the editors. They want to do a new edition. The press says, okay, but you need to incorporate some of these like newer, more interesting like changes in American cuisine. And they're like, we can't do that. They're like, we think it's fatty. That like, it's actually a really interesting story because in the beginning it feels very progressive. And then by the end, it's sort of traditional in a way, like resisting certain things that are seen as like, well, you know, soul food or specifically. And so then they're like, okay, well, we were thinking maybe you could do a baking book. And they took it to, Ettenheim takes it to the board, and they decide not to do the baking book. But then all of a sudden there's this correspondence that's like, yes, we're totally doing the baking book. And I find out later that it was the baking book or nothing, right? Like the press did not want to do another like rehashing of the same cookbook. They were like, you are known for good baking recipes. Like, why don't we do that? And you can add more and, you know, we'll do that. And then Barbara Kafka, who was like a food writer at the time, was supposed to do the introduction, and then she fell ill, and then it was pushed off forever, and then it became like this, like there's a piece in the minutes of one of the settlement board meetings where Sarah Ettenheim says, you know, what should we do? Should we just let this die a natural death, right? So the last one by Simon & Schuster comes out in 76. It's either 76 or 73, and it's escaping me right now. But so after like the saga in the 80s, there is this this one editor that says, you know, this is actually a really interesting book. Like maybe we revisit it. And so the 1991 edition is back there, and it's very different. It's called I think it's the first collection of American ethnic recipes. There's no heart anywhere. It's edited by somebody new who gives a story of the cookbook. Doesn't really. Kind of mythologize it in the same way, but gives a story. And one of the interesting things is that they have gefilte fish in there, and it is the filled fish. It's not the Lincoln House balls. That's the recipe they chose to use. So they were like trying to make it more like the earlier book than how it became later. And it was just interesting. There was one review of this cookbook, of the 1991 review, that said, I mean, I think that the earlier writers would be so surprised to see recipes like pad thai in here and, you know, and curry. And I'm like, matzo balls and mulligatawny were on the same page in the first edition. So I actually think that's not the case, you know. But anyway, so that's why, who knows? Maybe now there will be more interest in the Settlement Cookbook. Maybe there'll be a new one.
Will we keep it in our hearts and minds forever?
Thank you.
Right. There's no further questions. Please join me.